Welcome back, everyone. My guest today is Evan Thompson. Evan is professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, where he's also an associate member of the Department of Asian Studies and the Department of Psychology. He's also a fellow at the Royal Society of Canada. I wanted to talk to Evan today about his latest book. It's called Why I Am Not a Buddhist. And I actually wrote a short essay on this book that I'll link to below, explaining in my own words some of the core concepts. Two of the most important ones that we talk about in this episode are Buddhist modernism and Buddhist exceptionalism. And I found that there was some interesting and lively discussion around those topics, around that essay when I first published it. And it felt like it deserved further investigation. And so there were a number of reasons why I've been wanting to talk to Evan. And so I thought this was a good opportunity. So we get into what this book is, why Evan is not a Buddhist. He distinguishes himself from several other contemporary Buddhist scholars or popularizers, maybe we should say, people like Sam Harris and Robert Wright. We get into those discussions and disagreements that he has with them. But I start the show with his earlier book that he co wrote with Francisco Varela and Eleanor Roche. That book is titled The Embodied Mind. And if you're at all interested in dialogues between cognitive science, especially the cognitive science of perception and action, in dialogue with Buddhist contemplative practice and phenomenology, and you don't know about this book, then this is one that you really should put on your reading list and get to reading right away. This is, for many people, sort of the start of a very long and rich dialogue between several different ways of knowing the world, several different traditions of knowledge and practice coming together to investigate human experience. I wanted to start with this book because it's actually just recently been reissued. The first edition was published in 1991, and I believe Evan mentions in the podcast that I think he was a graduate student when he and Varela started working on the manuscript. So you could imagine the difference between beginning to write a manuscript as a graduate student versus your more mature perspective as a senior scholar. So what we get in the revised edition is actually a new introduction from Evan, where he lays out some of the things that he would do differently now, some of the ways that his thought on Buddhism and contemplative practice and the interface with science and philosophy has changed. This introduction, I thought, was a very good on ramp into the new book, Why I'm Not a Buddhist. So we spend a little bit of time talking about Evan's background, how he came to write The Embodied Mind, his relationship with Francisco Varela, his time at Lindisfarne, some of the things that transpired while he was there that kind of have informed his perspective later on in life. And so we get a really nice story, I think, of Evan's evolution over time, culminating in this book, Why I Am Not a Buddhist. Um, Great episode, great dialogue. Really happy to have Evan on the show. And without further ado, I want to welcome Evan Thompson. Welcome to the podcast, Evan. So glad that you can join us today.
Thanks for inviting me to be here.
There are so many aspects of your work that have been influential on the side view that I actually found it a little bit difficult to find like the one right way into starting this conversation. But what I finally landed on was the revised introduction to the reissue of The Embodied Mind. And why I thought that was an interesting place to start was because in that book you actually trace out some of the big evolutions that your own thought has gone through since that book was first published. And so I kind of wanted to start with some of those transformations as a way into your new book, Why I'm Not a Buddhist. So in that book, you talk about some of the shifts in your understanding of Buddhist contemplative practices, especially, and the way you characterized it in the Embodied Mind. Can you just give us a little summary about what some of those shifts were, and maybe even more so, how you came to those shifts in your own life?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's actually a big question. It's a fun question. So maybe just to give you and listeners a little bit of background context before I talk specifics. The Embodied Mind. So it was published first in 1991. We started writing it. That is, Francisco Varela and I started writing it in Paris in 1986. So the process of writing, and then Eleanor Roche joined us as a third author in 1989, and so then there was another period of time where we were all three working together. So the book really, in terms of its initial kind of conceptualization and the initial stages of writing, goes back to the mid 80s, and that's a long time ago. I was a graduate student in philosophy at that time. I was I was a young graduate student because I went to college when I was 16 and started graduate school when I was 21, and so everything that I was doing at that point really reflected a very young perspective and inexperienced perspective in some ways. So there's everything that's happened since then over the intervening decades in my own life. If Francisco Varela were still alive, he would of course have gone through many transformations. He died in 2001. He would have a whole different take on it. Eleanor Roche also wrote a new introduction to the book, so she has her later reflective take as well. So it's just to say that it's a case where when I started to write the introduction to the revised edition, I think I would have been writing that in 2015 or 16. There was a lot of time between when I worked on the book at first and then when I was writing the introduction. So so that's just to frame things in very kind of general autobiographical chronological ways. More specifically, I would say that when I was when we were writing the book in the 1980s, we were there was really no discussion, or very very little discussion, of Buddhism and science, specifically Buddhism and the sciences of the mind, Buddhism and cognitive science. And so what we were really trying to do was to create a framework where that discussion would be possible. And our approach was to draw from Buddhist meditation practice and Buddhist philosophy, and to present it as an experiential, in philosophical terms, a phenomenological investigation of the mind and the experience of self and consciousness, in ways that brought out phenomena that cognitive science was interested in: how we experience the self, how when we seem to, when we look for a self and try to analyze the body mind complex, we don't seem to find what we at least naively would assume would be a self. So we were trying to create a large framework in which that discussion could happen, and in which this was kind of the overriding message of the book, I suppose, in which the increasingly sophisticated scientific study of the mind could be complemented by a sophisticated approach through lived experience
Mhm.
itself. And that's how we brought Buddhism into exchange with cognitive science. So now, many many years later, I would say, that I think there's still something right about that, but I think also that certain ways we did that are naive. And by naive, I mean, not so much. I don't mean stupid. In part ignorant, and in part just naive, in the sense of like inexperienced, youthful. A lot of
Mhm.
things have happened since then. So what specifically? Well, we we were, and this is something I write about also in my book, Mind and Life. We were very quick to dismiss European phenomenological philosophy as not really having a kind of pragmatic grounding, and hence why we needed to go to what we were thinking of as a Buddhist phenomenology. So that's very simplistic, and not really, it doesn't really do justice to the phenomenological tradition. And a lot has been written about that since. There's been a whole evolution of discussion of philosophical phenomenology in the European tradition and the ways in which it aligns and doesn't align with different, elements of Buddhist philosophy or Buddhist practice. So we handled that kind of rather quickly. And our basic way of doing that was to say, well, you know, Western phenomenology got mired in theory, and Buddhist phenomenology is, empirical. That's I would say, stated like that, I would just say it's false. I mean, I now think that that's false. That Buddhist phenomenology, if we're going to use that word, really Buddhist philosophical psychology would be what I would call it today, is every bit as theoretical and subject to theoretical debates, and as close or as removed from, let's say, the lived experience of meditation as anything that you would find in Western phenomenology. So that's one way in which I really have changed my thinking, and that's in part just because you learn more as you dive into these things. So that's one point. Another point is that since we wrote the book, there's been this whole boom of interest in mindfulness. Um, some of that has to do with the scientific study of mindfulness practices. Some of it has to do with the development of clinical and secular mindfulness techniques outside of the context of Buddhism for dealing with, depression or chronic pain. None of that was around when we wrote The Embodied Mind. And we use the term, we actually use the term mindful awareness rather than, I mean, sometimes we use the word mindfulness, but mostly we talk about, the practice of mindful awareness. So, in light of that whole development, I thought it was important to say in the introduction that the view in cognitive science we were proposing in The Embodied Mind, an embodied and active view that sees the mind as constituted by bodily processes in relationship to the environment, that perspective actually, for the most part, isn't brought to bear today on the study of mindfulness, and that's to the detriment of the science of mindfulness. It's very, a lot of it is very in the head centered, very neurocentric, with fancy, neuroimaging tools that also didn't exist when we wrote The Embodied Mind. There was no functional magnetic resonance imaging of the human brain when we were writing The Embodied Mind. That all emerged in the 90s. And the science of meditation, or of meditation practices, including mindfulness practices, a lot of it, by no means all of it, but a lot of it became very neurocentric and very focused on what happens when we put meditators, experienced versus inexperienced, in brain scanners and look at the differences in their brain activity. And sometimes that research is illuminating, sometimes it's not illuminating at all because the questions that are being asked aren't even the right ones to ask. So it was important in writing the introduction to the new version of The Embodied Mind that it be pointed out that the embodied and active perspective in cognitive science actually really is the perspective that should be framing how we think about the scientific investigation of these practices, not as just a narrow, limited cognitive neuroscience one, even limited within the frame of cognitive neuroscience itself sometimes. So that was another point. And then I suppose one more point I'll mention is that when we wrote The Embodied Mind, we were very uncritical or not knowledgeable sufficiently about how Buddhism, in terms of the way we perceive it in the Western world, the European, North American world, how that is so shaped and refracted by what historians call Buddhist modernism. The idea that Buddhism in Asia, in colonial situations, transformed itself in order to counter the presentation of Christianity as the superior scientific religion. So the Asian Buddhists very cleverly turned the argument around and said, well, Buddhism is actually a science. It's more scientific. Meditation is a kind of scientific introspective examination of the mind. We don't posit a creator God. We don't posit an immortal, unchanging soul. So we're more in keeping with the impulse of modern science that says everything is flux. And that whole way of presenting Buddhism, of sort of minimizing or stripping out traditional ritual and metaphysical beliefs or metaphysical frameworks, was a packaging of Buddhism in Asia originally that gets exported to the West, that Westerners love because they're dissatisfied with Christianity. And there's the rise of modern, materialist science and their hunger for what we would now call, spirituality. So they fasten on to that. They rework it themselves. It gets, exported back to Asia, and then it becomes this like ping pong back and forth between Asia and the West. And we in the embodied mind, specifically in terms of the meditation texts that we cite and that we use as reference points for meditation, all of which are from modern Buddhist teachers and are framed in terms of Buddhist modernism, we just really weren't aware of the complexity of that situation. We talk about Buddhist philosophy in the embodied mind in the form of like historical figures like Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu, and of course we were working from historical Buddhist philosophical scholarship there. But in terms of the way we presented meditation and thought about meditation practice, it was very much refracted through this modernist lens, which in and of itself is just an evolution and transformation in human experience, but we weren't actually cognizant of that. So that's another way in which my perspective changed, is that I really learned just a lot more about that, and there was a lot more scholarship that emerged on that over the course of the past couple decades. So those are some of the main differences in just where we were when we wrote the book and where we are now.
Right, right. And so, I mean, there's three really rich veins of inquiry there between the phenomenology, the Buddhism, and the cognitive science. And as you just mentioned, all three of those lines have developed quite a bit since the book was written, but also the dialogue between them has developed substantially. And I think in part because of the conversations that book initiated. What do you think it was about your context and your work with Varela that placed you at a crossroads like that? I mean, it's not just one strand of sort of fastly evolving inquiry that you kind of plugged into, but three intersecting ones, So
Yeah.
what was that context like that made that the obvious move for you to make?
Yeah. Well, that had a lot to do with Varela himself and what he was working with in his personal and intellectual life. And it also had a lot to do with the upbringing I had in the institute organization that my parents founded called the Lindisfarne Association. So to take the Lindisfarne Association first, my dad he was a university professor, full professor with tenure. His field of training was English literature, but he very quickly kind of wrote more broadly about history and cultural criticism, you could say, and myth. And he quit the university. He set up the Lindisfarne Association. This was an alternative educational institute that was also an intentional community. And the idea, so this is like 1973, the idea was to bring together philosophers, artists, scientists, activists, spiritual, religious teachers to try to find a new way forward for human culture in the face of things like, at that time already, the so-called energy crisis and the recognition of what today we think of as the climate crisis. So, ecological environmental destruction. And I grew up in that context. So I was, really exposed to a lot of different kinds of ideas, that some of which flowed into the university, but a lot was sort of outside the mainstream, in the sense that although a number of people who participated in these conferences and discussions at Lindisfarne, they were university trained people. Some of them had university positions. They were sort of para academics. They were, it was the so-called counterculture. So there was no internet then, but it was a little bit like the intellectual scene on the internet that kind of intersects with the university, but it's its own thing too. So it was an early version of that. And so I just kind of grew up around a whole mix of different ideas in science and philosophy and politics and art. And very early on, in my own life, when I was 14, I think, I met Francisco Varela because he came at the invitation of my dad and the cybernetic anthropologist thinker Gregory Bateson to a conference they organized. And Varela, so he became part of this Lindisfarne discussion, and that it also affected his own work and life and thinking. And to come to him, I mean, he was a very unusual scientist because, he had a PhD in biology from Harvard, did work, detailed work on the physiology and anatomy of the visual system, was from Chile, so had a mix of both, Ivy League training and Latin American culture and background, South American, and was a very philosophical person. He had been raised, taught by German Jesuitical, teachers in Catholic school in Chile, had read philosophy from a young age, always had a very big sort of way that he thought about science and knowledge. So he was just unusual in that way. And then he was, a kind of brilliant, innovative scientist who did innovative work in biology and math and logic, and then in eventually what became known as cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience also at the point at which he died. And he had been forced to flee Chile because of the coup, the ousting of the elected government of Allende with the coup by Pinochet. And so he had to flee his country and arrived back in the United States in a kind of existential crisis and found Buddhist meditation practice
Mm.
through Trungpa, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who was also a very, problematic figure, but very charismatic teacher in the 1970s and 1980s, who also at the Naropa Institute brought together, a diverse range of intellectuals and spiritual teachers. So Francisco was immersed in that. He was immersed in Lindisfarne. And when it came time for him to think about how he wanted to put together his interest in Buddhist practice and Buddhist philosophy and science, phenomenology was a natural frame for him because he had already been reading the phenomenological philosophers like, Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty. And I had gotten my undergraduate training in Asian studies. I studied Chinese language and history, and then eventually got into Buddhist philosophy. And then I was in graduate school in philosophy, starting to work actually in philosophy of mind and cognitive science. So it all just kind of came together around the mid 1980s. And, Varela said, I have these transcripts of lectures I gave on Buddhism and science, Buddhism and cognitive science. Can you come and work with me as a research, assistant? Go over these lecture transcripts. Maybe we can put them together into something that would, um, be a paper or maybe even a book. And he contacted me because we knew each other, and he was kind of like an older brother, like uncle
Mhm.
figure to me, mentor. And he knew that I had an academic background as an undergrad in Asian studies, and that I was now studying philosophy and cognitive science. And he had a connection to a German fellowship, German foundation that could like fund me for a summer in Paris. So it just kind of all came together, all these different
Mm.
elements in this fortuitous,
Mhm.
way. I mean, in that sense, I feel very, I mean, I just feel very grateful and fortunate that that was all able to come together in the way that it did at that time. I mean, it was unplanned in a way.
Right,
It just kind of happened.
right. I want to get back to Buddhist modernism in just a second, but you mentioned there that relationship between the Lindisfarne crowd and the sort of para-academic atmosphere, but also Varela's traditional training, your traditional training in a university setting. How important is that, do you think, for a book like this, for the embodied mind? And do you see,
Mm.
I mean, it really feels like there was a period, maybe especially in American history, in that post 60s environment where that kind of work was flourishing a little bit more. It doesn't seem like that. I don't have the same sense that I grew up in the same
Uh-huh.
situation, say. Do you see that kind of para academic work still happening in an effective way? And do you think it's important to keep those kinds of institutions alive, or what's your general read?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think about this a lot actually. Um, so I mean, to go back to the beginning of your question, I would say that, the embodied mind would not have had the kind of influence it has if it hadn't been written by um, two very well-known and pioneering scientists,
Mm-hmm.
namely Francisco and Eleanor Roche, who is a huge pioneer in cognitive psychology and the study of categorization and concept formation. Um, so that combined, then, I mean, I was unknown, of course. They were very well known. I brought, the perspective of philosophy in the sense in which like someone's trained to be a philosopher. So if there weren't those um, kind of academically recognized and trained, let's call them authorial voices in the
Right.
book, and it hadn't been published by MIT Press, which was like the premier press, still is one of them for cognitive science.
Right.
There's no way it would have had the influence that it had. I mean, if it had been published by um I don't know, like, Shambhala, for example. Like Shambhala publishes a lot of great stuff, but it's a Buddhist press. A
Mm-hmm.
book on Buddhism and science published in Shambhala would get a certain readership for sure, but it's not going to have the academic clout and influence that
Mm-hmm.
publishing with MIT does. And, of course, we knew that at the time, and we wanted it to be published by MIT for precisely that reason. Um, so that is to say that there was a good intersection of the para academic and the academic that happened. In terms of today, I mean, today's a very different situation for a number of reasons. On the one hand, there's the internet, and so there is a whole access to information, from a range of perspectives, some awful and terrible, some really interesting,
Yeah.
that you can get just by opening your laptop, and that's so different from the 70s 80s period. On the other hand, there's a kind of cultural conservatism that's in place now, not to downplay all the sort of amazing things that are happening in small pockets that we might not know about, because the world is a big place with a lot of things happening.
Right.
But there's a kind of, I mean, 1980 was the election. I started my undergraduate studies in 1979, 1980. That was the year Reagan was elected. And that was the rise of a whole conservative neoliberal um, world and worldview that makes our time in the aftermath of that very different from the 60s 70s time when a lot of these para academic things were
Mm-hmm.
flourishing. The fact that like my dad could quit a full professor tenured position and support himself outside the university, it's not impossible now, but it's a lot harder now than it was
Mm-hmm.
then.
Mm-hmm.
So there are these big cultural shifts. But right now, we're in the midst of a pandemic. There's the climate crisis. A lot of things have changed in the past 18 months. A lot of things are going to be different in the next years going forward. So who knows what things are going to look like exactly.
Right. Yeah, and that's the line that I keep running up against, and a lot of the people that I talk to in these online spaces keep running up against, is that it's it's fairly easy if you just learn a little bit about internet and a little bit about technology to do something like this, to have you
Right,
on, to
right.
have a conversation, can share it with people, they can share it with other people. Pretty straightforward. We can even create, between all of us, a kind of a culture of those conversations, of that, the different philosophical movements, systems of ideas and things like that. Getting to that next step of institution building, or making a living off of it, in the sense that you could quit your day job,
Right.
is like a completely different thing, and we do it anyway because we think it's worth doing, and it's enriching to us, and we feel like it's making an important contribution to the culture. But yeah, I look at something like Lindisfarne, and it seems to be like something that we would benefit from again these days. And there's a question. The question I have is, how do you move it from the virtual space into a physical space? Because even the benefits that we get from being able to talk remotely, share things online and write these essays and open access publishing, so on. It doesn't fill the void of actual community building in
Yeah.
person. So yeah, I was just curious about
Yeah, no,
that environment.
I understand the feeling. I mean, I think, just in the past like 18 months with the pandemic, I've had way more conversations like the one we're having now, both in terms of like what we're talking about and also just in terms of the medium in which we're using to talk about it. And that's created a kind of, distributed connectivity that I think is really interesting and valuable. But as you say, it's virtual. It's not physical. And of course, physical connectivity is a problem in a pandemic too. So
Sure.
there's the question of how we're gonna go forward with that whole situation. Things look better in some ways and they look not so good in other ways. So I don't know how that's gonna go. But I know the feeling, and I don't know what the answer is. I don't know how that's gonna evolve. Yeah.
Right. Right. And it's certainly related to the larger questions of what's already been happening to universities anyway, in terms
Yeah.
of funding, student loans and debt and jobs,
Yeah.
careers, things like that. Even finding you know stable career inside of the traditional pathway is harder now
It's very hard.
than it
Yeah.
used to be. So in some sense, we do this because we love to do it, but in another sense, there's a kind of imperative to see if maybe we can't turn these conversations and these sort of collective investigations of ideas into something else. So
Hmm.
anyway, side thought I had when you were talking about Lindisfarne. Let's talk about let's shift to your newest book, Why I'm Not a Buddhist. You already mentioned Buddhist modernism. I'd say the twin concepts that uh, motivate that book are Buddhist modernism and Buddhist exceptionalism. So can we just say a little bit more about what those concepts mean before we kind of move ahead into the contemporary scene?
Right. Sure. So Buddhist modernism is a term that historians use to refer to the way that Buddhism modernized itself beginning in the 19th century, maybe in some respects even a little bit earlier. And it's a kind of transnational form of Buddhism that has, you could say, become a kind of lingua franca for talking about Buddhism. And it downplays the traditional Asian um, ritual community folk aspects of Buddhism, along with traditional, um, I suppose you could say, metaphysical views like rebirth and karma, and reconceptualizes Buddhism as about personal experience in the form of meditation, and either presents Buddhism as a kind of science, a kind of science of the mind, or as a kind of philosophy, rational empirical philosophy, or way of life that's, as we like to say in the world now, spiritual but not religious. Um, all of that is very much formed by the influence, actually, of European Protestantism and Romanticism and American Transcendentalism. So that's why I mean by it's a kind of a hybrid of
Mhm.
European elements that influenced Asians as they rethought Buddhism in the 19th century, 20th century. Um, and Buddhist exceptionalism is a term that I use to refer to the idea that runs through most Buddhist modernism. It's not like it's an essential property of Buddhist modernism. It's more like a prevalent trait that Buddhism is different from all other religions in that it is especially empirical and rational and compatible with science and grounded in direct personal experience of the mind, of how the mind is when you sit down, meditate, and look at the mind, thinking of that practice as a kind of laying bare of the mind directly and immediately. So Buddhist exceptionalism is the idea that, well, Buddhism really is exceptional in the way that it does those things, unlike Christianity or Islam or Judaism or what have you. And so the book, Why I'm Not a Buddhist, is a critique of Buddhist exceptionalism, and I argue that Buddhist exceptionalism distorts Buddhism in that the claims that the Buddhist exceptionalists make don't stand up to historical scrutiny. If you're looking at Buddhism as, uh, as a evolving tradition through many different cultures and time periods, and that it doesn't even really work for much of Buddhism today, in that Buddhism is very much about transcendence and the sacred, and ideas that are fundamentally religious ideas, and that it also distorts science and religion because it thinks of whether a religion is rational or irrational or empirical or non-empirical according to criteria of scientific evaluation, where religion is doing something different from what science does,
Mm-hmm.
in the way that art does something different from what science does. And so to try to evaluate religion straightforwardly in terms of scientific constructs doesn't really understand what religion is about. So that in very general terms is
Yeah.
is what's going on in the book.
Yeah. 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 I want to pick up on a few of those threads there. In the book, you write about, Sam Harris and Robert Wright. I also listened to the conversations that you had with both of them
Right.
about the book, and I, I had a lot of thoughts listening to both of those dialogues and to reading those sections in the book. And one thing that I became aware of in the dialogue was that on the one hand, there's the sort of historical anthropological conversation about whether or not what you're saying about Buddhist modernism is true, and I think it seems in terms of the scholarship, it's straightforwardly true. Um, and it seemed like in those conversations there was resistance even to that idea that was a good way, especially in the conversation with Sam Harris. He made a big deal out of the Buddhist exceptionalism piece, saying that
Right.
there were philosophical aspects of Buddhism that you just couldn't find in other texts, and they're uniquely aligned with scientific insight. But I felt like there was a more subtle and deeper connection there, where, and I'm wondering what you think about this. If what you were saying about Buddhist modernism were true, then for these people, it seemed like Buddhism could no longer be valuable in the way they thought it was. Does that
Mhm.
make sense?
I
In
think
other
I
words,
see what you're
in
saying.
other
Yeah.
in other words, the value for a person
That's
like
right.
that
Yeah.
is in terms of its scientific validity. And if it
Mhm.
loses that scientific validity, then it's something that's not worth doing. And I see you as saying something really different. And I've had that conversation a couple of times with other people, where there seems like there's something to be untangled there, where it's you I come away feeling like when I read what you're saying, I get a better, more nuanced picture of science and a better, more nuanced picture of Buddhism.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering if you had encountered that, or what's going on with the resistance when you have these conversations with folks.
Right. Right. Um, yeah, I think you have put your finger on something, and that is that for certain people, and I think this is would be true, at least based on my experience of talking with them and reading their works, of both Sam Harris and Robert Wright, though in different ways. In those two cases, there is, I think, there is the feeling that why Buddhism, or the particular version of Buddhism that they're selecting and working with, why that is valuable is in part because they think that it can be articulated in a scientific idiom, and it can be justified and legitimized by way of articulating it in a scientific idiom. And if it were not possible to do that, or if that turned out not to be the right thing to do, then I think it would be destabilizing. It would be less appealing for them. Maybe they would still find meditation a personally valuable practice, or maybe they wouldn't. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's conceivable you could just still do meditation practice because you find it benefits your life, even if you don't, frame it for yourself that way. But I
Mhm.
think as writers and thinkers, as intellectuals, it it validates meditation because of the scientific language that they use to frame it. And for me, that's a bit like it's a bit like saying, well, because I can show that it really benefits the child's brain to learn to play the violin, that therefore playing the violin, playing Bach, learning how to play Bach on the violin is valuable. I mean, that's just skewed in my view. It's like,
Mhm.
of course, it's great that, learning to play the violin benefits the development of the brain. Um, and you should be exposed to a wide range of different kinds of human practices as you grow up. But that's not what validates Bach. That's not what validates playing the violin, or
Right.
it's not the only thing by any means. So I think you're right. That element for them is in the mix, and I don't look at it that way. I look at it as, meditation is a practice that is like art. It's something, or it's not to say it's the same as art, but it's something that you do in a way because it has its own inherent value.
Right.
And um I wouldn't try to, as I say, justify art through science. I would think it would be very interesting to see a conversation between art and science, in the form of, you know, uh, intellectual history, proficient artists talking to proficient scientists. That's interesting, but not
Mhm.
because we're going to use one to justify the other.
Right. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. So a related question. I was talking to a friend about the book and about the title of the book, and he said, the book would have made more sense to me if the title was "Why I'm Not a Buddhist Modernist."
Yeah, I've gotten that from a number of people actually.
And so why specifically a I am not a Buddhist, and relatedly, I'm not part of a practicing Buddhist community or anything, but it's an edge that I brush up against. I know,
Right.
many Americans who are practicing American Buddhists. Given this intervention, um, what's your hope that they continue practicing, they continue being a
Right.
part of their communities, but
Right.
th- they look at it in a different way, or
Yeah.
what's
Yeah.
your hope with that?
Right. Right. So, um, yes. So, with regard to the title, the reason I chose that title was it just came to me spontaneously because people assumed I was a Buddhist, because, because of the embodied mind, because I participate in, events that involve a lot of Buddhists, and some of them are at, Buddhist centers. Um, so I would find just in conversations, people would just assume, I'm a Buddhist. And when I would say, well, no, actually I'm not, they would kind of look at me funny, and they'd want to know why. And sometimes they were like really interested. Oh, why not? And sometimes they were like, well, but shouldn't you be? And so the title kind of came out of that. And the relationship to Buddhist modernism is that virtually all the Buddhism that I was interacting with, and that was actually in a way available to me as a Westerner who's not, raised in an Asian family, just, growing up in a Asian Buddhist household, was Buddhist modernism. And my philosophical dissatisfaction came from Buddhist modernism. And then if you sort of dig deeper and say, okay, well, so let me just summarize that. So the idea was that, well, I wasn't raised in an Asian Buddhist family. I wasn't drawn to go to Asia and try to become, say, like a monastic in an Asian monastic setting. That was not. I mean, I thought about it at one point in my life, actually, but it wasn't really something that I felt was right for me. And so then there's Buddhist modernism, which is the way most people in my situation or in the West um, are Buddhists, and that I had come to have real intellectual misgivings about. So that's sort of why I'm not a Buddhist. But then if you dig deeper, um, and this, I don't talk about this explicitly a lot in the book. There's a couple places where it pops up. Um, there are certain fundamental tenets, propositions that I think of as in the like deep inner engine of Buddhism that I can't really accept. And so that would be a deeper sense of why I'm not a Buddhist. I put that out there now. We can talk about that, but I want to come back to what you were asking. What's the hope in terms of my addressing Buddhists. So one thing it's really important to say is that I never in the book argue that one shouldn't be a Buddhist. So I never say to Buddhists, you're wrong in being a Buddhist. So this is like, I think, something that makes my argument very different from, for example, Bertrand Russell when he wrote Why I'm Not a Christian, right? He was like attacking Christianity as, as invalid and as pernicious. And um, I'm not doing that with Buddhism. I'm not saying to any Buddhist, you shouldn't identify as a Buddhist, you shouldn't be a Buddhist. I'm saying Buddhist modernism is problematic for all of these reasons. So if you want to be a Buddhist and you want to, in some sense of the word, be modern, or since modern is a loaded word, let's say if you don't want to be fundamentalist and you want Buddhism to be in sync with contemporary culture, Buddhist modernism is not a good way to do it for the following reasons. So in that sense, what I'm trying to do, this will sound maybe presumptuous, but I'm trying actually in the form of a philosophical critique to give Buddhists a helping hand in a way. As I say in the book, I see myself as a good friend to Buddhists, and a good friend is someone who says, look, I don't really think you should say that. That's not going to help. So that's how I see what I'm doing. I mean, it's for Buddhists to decide whether they want to listen to that or whether it means something for them. That's not for me to say, right? But that's my hope, is that especially in the Buddhism science discussion,
Yeah.
that it will evolve beyond trying to either legitimize Buddhism using science or embellish science using Buddhism, which we also see, that it will become a richer discussion about knowledge and ethics and human practices of knowing. That's the hope in more philosophical terms.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The other related point that came up in some of my discussions was um, sort of questioning the idea that Buddhist modernism itself was kind of one thing.
Mm-hmm.
You single out a few people specifically in the book, but I didn't take it to mean, and maybe just because it's not a charged topic for me, because I'm not really involved in these communities, and so for me it's a kind of, there's a philosophical and anthropological and historical kind of curiosity to the situation, but I don't feel like it's addressing me. I don't, I'm just fascinated by the conversation, and especially how it raises interesting points about um, Western practice traditions, Western philosophy, and the dialogue those traditions could have with cognitive science, which could be
Mm-hmm.
just as interesting as
Right.
the
Right.
Buddhism science dialogue. So I look at it from that perspective. But yeah, that was the other thing that came up in some of my discussions, was just this idea that, like, well, is everybody this particular kind of Buddhist modernist, or aren't we in the Western world, in America and Europe and elsewhere, doing this in different ways?
Mm-hmm.
And aren't there better and worse ways of doing that?
Right. So, I mean, it's true. Buddhist modernism is just a term, it's a label. It refers to a whole constellation of different things. Um, and there are important differences among them. And I do mention some of these in the book. So, one form of Buddhist modernism that's especially prevalent in North America is in its extreme form, what you sometimes see referred to as neural Buddhism, this idea that, Buddhism is going to allow you to, hack your brain, and um, it's all about training the brain, and it enables you to see, directly, experientially, that there is no self, which neuroscience is revealing in its own terrain. So there's that form of Buddhist modernism, but other forms of Buddhist modernism are not scientistic in that way at all. They're actually kind of romanticist. I mean, if you read like D.T. Suzuki and the way he's so influenced by, William James and, Emerson and American transcendentalists, you get a very different kind of Buddhist modernism that actually is much more influential in, say, modern art and postmodern art.
Mhm.
So for sure, Buddhist modernism is not one thing. That said, what I'm targeting are very prevalent traits of Buddhist modernism
Yeah.
across these different versions. So if somebody wants to say, I'm a Buddhist modernist, I have no problem with that either. The question for me is going to be, okay, so then what? Like, what are you doing? How are you doing it? What are you saying? Um, that's specifically what we're going to have a conversation about.
Right. Yeah, the other figure that came up in that conversation was Joanna Macy, and I was
Yeah.
just
Okay.
thinking in my head how different Joanna Macy talks and feels from, say, a Sam Harris or something like that.
Yeah.
And they're
Yeah.
in some sense they could both be
Right.
Buddhist modernists in a
Yeah.
way.
It's interesting you mentioned her, because I'm giving a talk this Wednesday. It'll be on, I don't know if I think they live stream it on YouTube. It's at the, Upaya Zen Center in
Hmm.
Santa Fe. It's their Wednesday Dharma talk. So I'm giving a talk about hope, and I talk about her in the talk, and juxtapose her actually to some other Buddhist teachers like Thich Nhat Hanh and Pema Chodron. I mean, the basic
Hmm.
idea of the talk is that there's a kind of anti-hope rhetoric in certain Buddhist circles,
Hmm.
which I think is extremely problematic, because I think it misunderstands philosophically the deeper sense of hope, which I think is very important for us to recover in our times right now. So Joanna Macy is an example of someone who actually doesn't do that. I mean,
Right.
she has a different kind of discourse. So I mentioned her precisely for that
Yeah.
reason. Yeah,
Nice.
yeah,
Well, maybe we can get into some of the philosophical issues then, and talk about, you already noted that there were specific philosophical propositions that
mm,
are part of Buddhist philosophy that aren't things that you would sign on to or agree with.
right.
Um, can we talk about a few of the main ones and
Sure,
explore the
sure.
reasoning behind that?
Yeah. So what I'm thinking of are the propositions that say that everything is conditioned, that conditioned things are suffering, and that nirvana is the unconditioned and is peace. That would be the core. So this is, the at the core of the Four Noble Truths. The Tibetan Buddhists call these the four seals, and they use it to identify whether a view is Buddhist or not. A
Mm.
view, according to that Tibetan Buddhist framework, a view is Buddhist if it recognizes that, um, everything compounded and conditioned is suffering, and suffering is, rooted in fundamental ignorance, and nirvana is peace, is the cessation of suffering. So, of course, these ideas, they get interpreted in all sorts of ways throughout, the 1,000 years of Buddhism developing philosophically and traveling throughout Asia and now in the West. Um, so we don't want to simplify what those propositions might mean. Nevertheless, they are, I think, core to, a Buddhist outlook. And I don't find the proposition that conditioned things, so the idea of something being, phenomena being conditioned and compounded, is the idea that, phenomena are subject to causes. Phenomena are what they are, independence, causal dependence on other things and on their parts, where that includes the idea of a kind of causal mental efficacy that gets, articulated in terms of karma. So a kind of moral causation, where good things tend to bring about, good things fundamentally bring about good things, bad things fundamentally bring about bad things. And that nirvana is, and that's inherently suffering. It's inherently unsatisfactory. um, and that the supreme purpose is the elimination of that suffering through the cessation of desire, attachment, clinging. And the supreme cessation, the ultimate cessation, is nirvana, is, the extinguishing of that craving and attachment. So I don't find that's fundamentally a kind, you could say that's a like ethical normative framework for the universe.
Hmm.
It's a very powerful one, and it's a very deep one, but it's not one that I fundamentally find myself able to subscribe to. I I don't accept the proposition that the inherent nature of conditioned existence is unsatisfactory, and that release or liberation is transcendence of it, however you understand transcendence.
Hmm.
That seems to me to be rooted in, it's a kind of existential assessment, you could say. It's an assessment of our existential situation, our existential predicament. And I've certainly felt very drawn to it at times, but I um and I can also see the power of living one's life in light of that framework, and I wouldn't want to gainsay any of that. But as a philosopher, it's not um it's not something that I find I can accept. Now, when I say that, it's not as if I think there's a decisive refutation of it. It's not like a
Hmm.
scientific proposition that you say, look, the evidence just isn't good for that. Or it's not like a logical proposition where you say, actually,
Right.
this turns out to, imply a contradiction or something like that, or it's inconsistent with other concepts. I
Hmm.
don't think it's like that. Um, it has an intelligibility and power, but I, I, I find that I'm trying to think of the best way to put this. It's almost aesthetic.
Yeah.
I can't I can't find myself drawn to it
Hmm.
aesthetically, and I'm much more drawn to a framework that affirms. I mean, I could put it this way: that affirms nature and life in a way that framework doesn't, by virtue of the claim about the fundamentality of suffering. Now, as I say all this again, I want to emphasize, it's not like I think you know, I don't think it's a question of like giving an argumentative refutation of something like that. Like I do
No.
think in Why I'm Not a Buddhist, I am giving argumentative refutations of Buddhist modernist ideas, right?
Yeah.
I think they're like conceptually incoherent, they're scientifically wrong, they're like demonstrably refutable, or they're
Hmm.
historically wrong. I don't think that what I just articulated is something that's subject to that kind of
Sure.
refutation. And
Yeah.
and that I think is an important difference.
Right. It's a kind of pre-philosophical commitment, or
Mhm.
precedes whatever that discussion would look like. Those
Right,
commitments do, I think.
right.
Well, so
Exactly.
do you? Is there a school or a tradition or a way of being that you do think articulates a positive
Yeah.
vision of things. I mean, I think there are plenty of traditions for whom the goal is to kind of sort of suspend that kind of
Right.
certainty about things. But do you find yourself in the orbit of anything or like that
Yeah.
where you would say that I'm not a Buddhist,
I'm a
like
yeah, I mean, uh there it's not like there's one thing. I mean,
yeah.
there are there are definitely, philosophical texts and figures throughout, world history that I'm drawn to and that are important for me. So in terms of ones that are, let's say, existentially important rather than just kind of intellectually important, um, my actual first love and what got me drawn into studying philosophy was early Chinese. Now we call them Taoist texts like Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. So Lao Tzu was actually what I first really was totally fascinated by and what led me into studying Chinese. Um, but Zhuangzi I find very compelling because there's an emphasis on constant change and transformation and the the irreducibility of different perspectives depending on the form of life and how those perspectives shift as you metamorphosize from one perspective to another, as in, like the parable of the butterfly dream, where
Mm-hmm.
um is it a man dreaming, he's a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he's a man, and you know the sort of undecidability of that. And then the way that Zhuangzi treats that with, lightness and humor, and doesn't try to present a system, and doesn't kind of give a, I mean, this is simplifying things, but Buddhism, even when it reaffirms the world, and says, nirvana and samsara are not two, Buddhism is still in some ways like an exit ramp strategy. It's like, you're on the highway, you're going round and round. Here's how you get off, right? You might choose to get back on the highway if you're a bodhisattva and like help other people, but basically it's about getting off the highway.
Yeah.
I'm simplifying. I realize I'm really simplifying, but Zhuangzi is not about getting off the highway. Zhuangzi is about,
Uh-huh.
um, harmoniously participating in the flux and transformations of the cosmos with grace and humility. And I find that very compelling and very
Uh-huh.
attractive. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What about Western thinkers or European thinkers,
Yeah.
things from those lineages?
Yeah. I mean, I've always been so my college roommate, um sam Sam Malo, Sam Mon Malo now. He always referred to me as a non-aligned mystic.
Mm.
So I've always been drawn to, mystical thinkers. Um, Medieval mystics. I love reading Simone Weil, even though like I'm not able to embrace Christianity even in her version of it, but I find, the voice of the seeker and the mystic. Um, I find that very compelling. I'm personally very drawn to that.
Mm-hmm.
Even actually in this talk I'm giving on Wednesday, where I'm talking about hope, I'm really relying heavily on Gabriel Marcel's essay on hope. So he's a Christian existentialist thinker. That's how he's
Mm-hmm.
usually labeled. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
not a Christian, but I find those existentialist, mystical lines of thought,
Yeah.
personally, again, it's aesthetic. I find that aesthetic very
Right.
personally compelling.
Yeah. I agree with you a lot on that evaluation. I'm in the same orbit of people. I love Simone Weil. The that comment about your roommate, um, I'm wondering if I can draw you out a little bit more on that. Um, when people are interested in that sort of mystic
Mm,
path or lineage, it's usually because they're trying to make sense of some of their own experiences, their own sort of
Right.
transformative events and encounters. Is that something that's been a part of your journey and that's shaped your work and the reason for doing it and things like that?
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, that comes out, I think, at least in terms of my writings, maybe more in Waking, Dreaming, Being, where, in that book, I'm really concerned with, um, how experience shifts across different sleep states and dreams and out of body experiences and things like that. These kinds of experiences are some of my earliest memories as a little kid. Very powerful dreams, sometimes terrifying dreams, sometimes ecstatic dreams, but really from very, like, I mean, maybe I was 3 or 4. I don't really know chronologically, but just in terms of my own inner life of memory, some of my very earliest memories are these very kind of intense liminal experiences that challenge the borders of so-called waking reality versus something else in sleep or in out of body experiences, which I also had when I was a teenager. Um, so those kinds of experiences and the both the sort of, I suppose you could say, ecstasy of them, in the literal sense of ecstasy, that it sort of takes you outside
Takes you
of,
out. Yeah.
yeah, both the ecstasy of them and then the destabilizing nature of them, the way that they, call into question what you think, how you
Hmm.
think things are. Um, those have affected, I suppose, my, or they're part of my being drawn to, mystical writings, because often the mystical writers have those kinds of experiences. Some, much more intense than anything I've ever had, and they're working in their practice and in their writing through those kinds of experiences.
Hmm.
Um, my dad also, had a lot of those kinds of experiences, and I think because I had some too, he very much framed how I thought of them, from the time I was a little kid. I never, he had them in the context of, like, life-threatening illnesses. He had cancer when he was a teenager. Um, so his experience was much more perilous in a way than mine ever was. But as a result of that, he looked at the world in a certain way, and that very much carried over onto me, just being a little kid and having dreams. And, we were always encouraged to talk about our dreams in the family. And so just like sharing experiences and things like that, they got framed very early
Hmm.
in terms of my parents, as these kinds of, like, altered state type experiences.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. How do you frame those experiences now? Do you worry about, I mean, in your books you're very careful about how you talk about these kinds
Mhm.
of things, which I think is to your credit, which I appreciate, which I had this assumption that your care around those topics might have been related to growing up in these sort of post 60s
That's part of it for sure. Yeah.
environments where
Yeah.
there's quite a ready embrace, for better and worse, of states like that and pursuit of them.
Right.
But how do you frame those things now? Do you worry about what kinds of experiences they are, sort of on a metaphysical level, or is
Oh,
that
sure.
and do you
Sure.
have, well, I'm just thinking now about your engagements with someone like Thomas Metzinger,
Mhm.
who, unless I missed a meeting, talks about a lot of these things as well, but
He does. Yeah.
um, is happy to say that these are sort of artifacts of
Right.
sort of biological accidents and misfires, and we can trigger these experiences reliably in laboratories, and it's just that we think that we're having an out of body experience, but really it's just this
Right.
one part of your brain is able to represent that to yourself, and so it seems that way, but nothing. It's more of a malfunction than sort of a metaphysical uh,
Right. Right.
interesting moment. So I'm
Right.
kind of wondering, like, how are you framing those things now?
Yeah. Um, I would say the framing is still very much the kind of framing that is in waking, dreaming being. So what I tried to do there is to be as accurate and faithful to the experience descriptively as possible from the sort of inward, subjective
Hmm.
perspective. Um, so in the case of whatever it is I'm talking about, out of body experiences or lucid dreams or near death experiences. I haven't personally experienced a near death experience, but I have, had out of body experiences and different kinds of lucid dream type experiences. So I try to be as descriptively accurate and, as you could say, conceptually precise as possible in presenting the experiences, as it were, on their own terms. But then from the interpretative perspective of, okay, so, how do we look at this through the lens of biology or cognitive psychology, let's just say cognitive science in general. um, I um, I also try to do that in as open a way as possible, not sort of shutting down or foreclosing questions and coming to conclusions, but just following where the evidence leads. And Thomas Metzinger is a good friend, and we've spent a lot of time talking about these things ourselves. And um, we definitely are very close on some of these things, and then we diverge in other ways.
Hmm.
um I think he is more inclined to give a, let's just say, a kind of reductionist physicalist account of the experiences, though he's very sophisticated in how he thinks about that.
Sure.
He's not dismissive of the experiences at all. On the contrary, he's had a lot of them himself, so he
Hmm.
sort of knows subjectively what it's like to have those experiences. Um, in the case of, I'll give a particular example. In the case of near death experiences, this became kind of a big issue for me when I was writing Waking Dreaming Being, because I haven't had those experiences. Um, but I became very interested in them because when I wrote a paper on neurophenomenology, um, some years before Waking Dreaming Being, it was a paper that I wrote, actually, with Antoine Lutz, who's a neuroscientist who does a lot of neuroscience and meditation research. He was a student of Francisco Varela. So we wrote this paper together, and we got an email when the paper was published. So this has been, like, I don't know, 2005 or six, somewhere around there. We got an email from Pim van Lommel, who's a Dutch cardiologist, one of the major researchers of near-death experiences, and he said, really enjoyed your neurophenomenology paper, but near-death experiences challenge the idea that every experience um, has a brain basis or a brain substrate. And his reason for saying that was that there were these experiences that happened during cardiac arrest when the brain wasn't functioning, where people reported, veridical out of body perceptions. And I thought, I got this. And I knew about near death experiences from, like, popular culture. And I'd probably seen a few, I don't know, maybe I had seen a few scientific articles about them. And I thought, oh, well, this is actually really interesting and important, if this is true. And, he had just published an article in The Lancet, which is, very, you know, reputable medical journal on near death experiences, where some of these anecdotes about vertical out of body perception were presented. So I thought, well, I have to find out more about this. So I started, I just read as much of the near death experience literature as I could get my hands on, including as much of the scientific studies as I could.
Hmm.
Obviously I read the books about near death experience narratives from people who had had them, and from, psychologists who interviewed people who had had them. But I really tried to track down the scientific findings about near death experiences. And I went into it thinking, oh, there's going to be some, very important suggestive scientific evidence about vertical out of body perception, or about these experiences happening at the time when the brain isn't working. And what I found out is that there isn't. That the vertical out of body perception stuff is anecdotal. It's not, which is not to say that it didn't happen. It's just to say that the evidence that we have
Mm-hmm.
is anecdotal. And the situation with regard to how we can measure the brain, especially deep areas of the brain that aren't maybe as immediately reflected in surface, EEGs where you only have a couple electrodes, how we can measure the brain and how we relate the after the fact retrospective reported timing of an experience, the subjective sense of time, to the objective time course of what's going on in the body and in the brain, where we have limited brain measurements. And in most cases, we're not concerned to measure people because we're trying to revive them. It was like, there isn't this kind of evidence. Now, maybe someday there will be. I'm not saying that
Right.
it is or it isn't. I'm just saying I went looking for evidence and I couldn't find it. And so that actually had a pretty strong effect on me, because I thought, well, there's this whole popular discourse and investment in these experiences as being a certain way, where science is cited as supporting it, and then you go look and
Right.
it's not like that. So that just suggested to me, we've got to be really careful, and we've got to be really cautious, and we've got to, we've got to proceed delicately, because we don't want to fall into saying something like, well, near death experiences are just illusions created by a dying brain,
Right.
because that sounds dismissive. I mean, these experiences are incredibly important for the people who have them. They're profoundly transformative in some cases. People live their lives differently after the experiences. So they
Right.
have an experiential reality. And so to say it's just an illusion cast by the dying brain, you know, that's a very warped way of looking at things, even if
Right.
it were to turn out to be the case, as the evidence seems to suggest, that there's no reason to think that they don't have a brain basis.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a, it's a delicate thing to pursue. It really requires some care, I think.
Right.
So that's just like an instance for all of these experiences, whether it's, you know ecstatic trances or ayahuasca or ritual firewalking. Like, take your pick of, things
Right.
that people single out. They all have to be handled in this careful way.
Yeah, and it seems like that's kind of where the conversation and certainly the science has been heading. And that's, I mean, again, I'm in this community in the Bay Area,
Right.
connected with the folks at CIS and
Mm,
and so on. Where I know your father was there for
right.
for
Yeah,
a
he
time
was.
as well. And just watching that transition from that kind of very experimental culture to now we're in the world of you know clinical FDA trials with
Right.
psychedelics and all of these different things, and
Yeah.
seeing that that's a really necessary and important phase to kind of rein in some of that speculation, but then also seeing, okay, the uh, a whole other conversation is now automatically kind of being initiated by looking at the way treating it as a clinical laboratory situation is also changing the nature of what those experiences are and what can
Sure.
happen in
Sure.
them. So yeah, there's a lot there, and like you said, it's a conversation to take slowly and carefully, especially because it invokes such sort of existential enthusiasm from people, because
Right.
it is often, whether it's the near death experience or some kind of sort of ecstatic or mystical rupture, it tends to be up there in the top 3, top 5 most significant experiences of that person's life, so
Right.
that brings a certain
Sure.
energy to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I'm wondering, maybe we can close out with just any 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 thoughts on where you think you might be heading next, or what you're working on now, or what you think is,
Right.
it seems like you always have a new project coming that's, even I was thinking this morning that, there's a point to why I'm not a Buddhist, but it's also connected to all of the other texts and projects, so I see connections between the different projects. But
Yeah.
where do you where are you going now, or what are you working on
Right.
next?
I'm working on two projects right now, two book projects. So one is a co-authored book with two physicist friends, Adam Frank, who's an astrophysicist, and um, does a lot of work on planetary system science, among other things, and Marcelo Gleiser, who's a theoretical physicist. The book is called The Blind Spot: Experience, Science, and the Search for Truth. There's a sort of like mini pre-version of some of the ideas in an Ion article online that we did a few years back called The Blind Spot. Basically, what we're doing in that book is we're arguing that we're trying to present a vision of science that is adequate for the culture that we need to build to deal with the climate crisis. And we're trying to articulate this both in a scientific and philosophical way, where the blind spot refers to how science loses sight of its origins in lived experience and gets caught up in reifying its own abstractions. And so, philosophers like Whitehead and Husserl are very kind of important for our thinking in this book, as well as a lot of stuff in more recent philosophy of science.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a co-authored book. We've got a kind of structure where we're looking at the blind spot and its historical philosophical origins, and then we go through a number of scientific domains, from matter at the quantum level to time and cosmology, life in the biological sense, mind and cognition and artificial intelligence, consciousness, and then the Earth as a whole planetary complex system, and looking at the blind spot and how it kind of figures in all of these different domains. So MIT's the book's under contract with MIT. We're aiming to have that one with the publisher, if all goes well, probably by the end of the summer. We're sort of in the midst of writing it right now. So that's one project, and that came out of our all being together at the Dartmouth center that Marcelo directed for a number of years, the Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Engagement. And then I'm writing a book, a single-authored book myself, that's about death and dying. It's called Dying: Our Ultimate Transformation. And the idea of that book is the sort of starting point for the book is to say we've never known more about death in biological, scientific terms in human history, and we've never been further removed from death in scientific human history. And as a result, we are kind of profoundly schizoid in how we deal with death in our culture. And what I'm trying to do in the book is to weave together scientific and philosophical, you could say spiritual perspectives on what happens when we die, particularly in the context today of hospice, where we have more a more extended dying period, and we have a movement of trying to care for the dying outside of a hospital setting. And that's not the only way human beings die by any means, obviously, in hospice, but I'm kind of mainly orienting the book towards that setting. At least I'm in the early phases of writing the book. It could expand a bit beyond that, but that's kind of the perspective or framework within which I'm working. So that book is probably still a couple of years away from the world. Yeah.
Wow. Well, those sound like equally important. I mean, existential individually and collectively topics to be addressing. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I've been looking forward to talking to you. I know that we could open up so many of these conversations, further and further. So, maybe when the next book is out, I can invite you back on and we can continue
that would be
the
great.
Conversation.
That would be lots of fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Definitely. Thanks so much, Evan.
Thank you.